The 1960s were an age of paranoia and possibility when filmmakers dared to dream beyond the stars, yet feared what they might find there. Some visions were mocked, others misunderstood. But decades later, their influence shaped everything, from modern blockbusters to quiet art house revelations. What if the greatest sci-fi stories of that decade were the ones the world almost forgot? Number 15. The Day the Earth Caught Fire, 1961. When it first hit theaters, this British disaster epic was dismissed as just another doomsday melodrama. But beneath its gritty black and white realism hid one of the most haunting what-if tales of the Cold War era. The premise was terrifyingly simple. Nuclear tests by rival superpowers knock the planet off its axis and send it hurtling toward the sun. The story unfolds through the weary eyes of a cynical newspaper reporter, played by Edward Judd, who realizes that government denials mask an irreversible catastrophe. London becomes a furnace of sweat and smoke. Panic spreads while scientists debate if another explosion might somehow save the world. It was realism meeting apocalypse, and audiences in 1961 were not ready for that kind of honesty. Censors demanded edits, fearing the film would fuel anti-nuclear protests during a time when optimism was mandatory. Director Val Guest ignored Hollywood gloss, opting instead for documentary-style chaos and sweat-soaked humanity. Critics found it too bleak, while audiences wanted escapism. Yet in the decades that followed, its prophetic imagery of collapsing infrastructure and suffocating heat gained new power. Modern climate scientists have called it the first environmental apocalypse on film. Its closing scene, where two front pages read "World Saved" and "World Doomed," remains one of cinema's greatest unanswered questions. The world never burned, but this movie's warning still smolders. Number 14. The Time Machine, 1960. When George Pal's adaptation of H.G. Wells's timeless novel premiered, audiences were awestruck by its visual wonder and existential melancholy. The film followed a Victorian inventor known only as George, who builds a shimmering brass contraption capable of piercing the fabric of time itself. What begins as a hopeful quest for progress turns into a vision of humanity's downfall. As centuries blur past in hypnotic stop motion, George witnesses cities rise and crumble until civilization collapses under nuclear fire. In the distant future, he finds the gentle Eloi and their underground predators, the Morlocks, metaphors for class decay that terrified 1960s viewers more than any monster. Religious groups accused the film of blasphemy for suggesting humanity would not be saved by faith, but consumed by ignorance. American censors cut seconds from the atomic war montage, fearing it might trigger Cold War hysteria. Behind the scenes, the production nearly collapsed when MGM executives wanted a cheerful ending. Pal refused. He fought for Wells's grim moral, that progress without empathy is destruction in disguise. His stubbornness paid off. The Time Machine won an Academy Award for its groundbreaking effects, and decades later inspired everything from Planet of the Apes to The Terminator. Today, it feels eerily modern, a cautionary dream crafted in brass and steam, reminding us that time travel is meaningless if we never learn from our mistakes. Number 13. Alphaville, 1965. Jean-Luc Godard's Alphaville was unlike any science fiction film ever made. Shot entirely on the real streets of Paris without special sets or futuristic props, it reimagined the genre as noir poetry. In this dystopian city ruled by a supercomputer named Alpha 60, logic has replaced love and poetry is a crime. Secret agent Lemmy Caution arrives from the outer galaxies to destroy the machine, but finds himself falling for a woman programmed to feel nothing. Audiences in 1965 were baffled. Critics argued it was pretentious nonsense. Censors in several countries called it subversive propaganda. But Godard was after something deeper. He turned bureaucracy and surveillance into surreal horror long before Orwellian metaphors became mainstream. The production was pure chaos. No permits, no sets, just Goddard directing on instinct as actors wandered through real office buildings pretending they were in a futuristic city. The result was hypnotic. Alphaville looked more alien than any soundstage creation because it showed the future hiding inside the present. Its legacy grew quietly. Decades later, directors like Ridley Scott, Terry Gilliam, and the Wachowskis would borrow its imagery. The neon solitude, the robotic voices, the haunting question, what is love in a world that forbids emotion? Alphaville predicted the digital soul trap of modern society. In its final whisper, Je vous aime, Godard left a message for the machines. Even logic cannot extinguish love. Number 12. Planet of the Apes, 1968. When Planet of the Apes premiered in 1968, it wasn't just another science fiction movie. It was a mirror aimed directly at mankind. Critics expected pulp nonsense with men in rubber masks. What they got instead was a blistering allegory about war race and self-destruction disguised as entertainment. The film opens with astronaut George Taylor crash landing on a strange planet ruled by intelligent apes who treat humans as mute animals. Beneath the spectacle lies a terrifying realization. The planet isn't alien at all. It's Earth centuries after humanity destroyed itself. That twist ending stunned audiences and turned silent theaters into gasping uproar. Yet before its release, studio executives panicked. Fox feared the ape makeup would look absurd and kill the movie's credibility. They nearly canceled the project until a single test reel convinced them otherwise. Even then, the censors demanded that its darker lines about evolution and religious hypocrisy be softened for international markets. Production was brutal. Actors endured 100-degree desert heat under suffocating prosthetics. Charlton Heston lost his voice screaming against ape soldiers in dust storms. But his raw desperation only made Taylor's breakdown more real. When the film finally hit theaters, it was an instant phenomenon, though some critics called it dangerously political. Over time, its influence deepened. It spawned sequels, a remake, and countless philosophical essays. That final image of the half-buried Statue of Liberty became cinema's eternal warning. Our downfall will be carved by our own hands. Planet of the Apes proved that science fiction could question civilization itself, and that revelation still echoes across the stars. Number 11. Fantastic Voyage, 1966. When Richard Fleischer's Fantastic Voyage arrived, it felt like a cinematic experiment that had no right to exist. The idea sounded absurd. Scientists miniaturized and injected into a human body to perform life-saving surgery from the inside. Yet the result was one of the decade's most visually stunning achievements. Audiences watched wide-eyed as a submarine floated through pulsing arteries and glowing synapses. The blend of anatomical realism and psychedelic color turned biology into outer space. Critics hailed it as science fiction that looked like a dream painted by a surgeon. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. The studio clashed over tone. Some wanted pulp adventure, others demanded medical realism. The censors grew nervous over the imagery of traveling through a body and even ordered certain anatomical details removed. Production went over budget as set designers built gigantic replicas of veins and lungs that filled entire sound stages. But here's the twist. Its message wasn't about shrinking, but seeing. The idea that humanity's greatest frontier wasn't the stars, but the body itself. That subtle philosophy resonated deeply during a decade obsessed with expansion and conquest. Fantastic Voyage won 2 Oscars for its art direction and effects, yet its deeper legacy lies in inspiration. It launched a wave of science meets imagination films from Inner Space to Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and even inspired real-world microsurgery pioneers. It asked a question that still lingers. What if the key to saving the future lies not in reaching space, but understanding ourselves? Number 10. The Andromeda Strain, 1971. Technically released at the dawn of the 70s, this Michael Crichton adaptation still embodies the paranoia born in the 60s. Cold, sterile, and disturbingly plausible, the Andromeda Strain explored what happens when humanity meets a microscopic visitor from the stars and loses. The plot unfolds like a clinical nightmare. A satellite crashes in the desert, bringing back an extraterrestrial organism that kills every living thing. In a small town, almost instantly, scientists race to contain the outbreak inside a top-secret underground facility where every level descends closer to annihilation. The film's realism terrified audiences. There were no monsters or laser guns, only isolation, contamination, and bureaucratic incompetence. Some viewers walked out claiming it looked too real. The U.S. military even investigated whether its depiction of biodefense protocols revealed classified information. Director Robert Wise shot it with precision using sterile lighting and computer readouts that felt prophetic, but the production nearly imploded when executives demanded a love subplot. Wise refused, saying emotion had no place in a story about extinction. He was right. The tension came from the coldness itself. When it finally released, it confused mainstream audiences, but scientists and critics hailed it as genius. Over decades, it gained cult status as one of the most realistic portrayals of scientific crisis management. The Andromeda Strain marked the end of the optimistic sci-fi era. It was a mirror of the new world, one where progress meant peril and the enemy was invisible. Number 9. Fahrenheit 451, 1966. When François Truffaut directed Fahrenheit 451, it was his first and only English-language film, and it burned like a quiet rebellion. Adapted from Ray Bradbury's novel, this wasn't a spectacle of spaceships, but of silence and censorship. The world it depicted felt terrifyingly plausible, a future where firemen no longer put out fires, but start them, torching books in the name of public happiness. Audiences in 1966 didn't know what to make of it. Some called it dull, others called it prophetic, but the film's cold detachment was deliberate. Truffaut crafted a society drained of emotion where conversation was outlawed and thought was treason. Oscar Werner played Montag the fireman who begins to question his duty after meeting a free-spirited young woman who asks a forbidden question, "Are you happy?" Behind the camera, Truffaut clashed bitterly with Werner, who resented his direction and reportedly refused to speak off set. Censors in several countries considered banning the film entirely, fearing its critique of authoritarian media would stir unrest. Even the studio grew nervous when audiences began comparing its message to real-world political crackdowns. But time transformed it. Fahrenheit 451's haunting images, rows of burning books, silent televisions whispering propaganda, became shorthand for censorship itself. Its ending, where rebels memorize entire books to preserve knowledge, turned the film from dystopia into poetry. Today, it stands as one of the few science fiction films that predicted the emotional numbness of the digital age. In a world drowning in noise, Fahrenheit 451 still asks the question that terrifies every regime. What happens when people start to think again? Number 8. The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. Though made slightly after the decade it belongs to, The Man Who Fell to Earth embodies the disillusioned spirit born from the 60s end. Nicholas Roeg's hallucinatory masterpiece followed Thomas Jerome Newton, a pale alien played by David Bowie, who comes to Earth seeking water for his dying planet. Instead, he finds addiction, greed, and loneliness in a civilization obsessed with consumption. When it premiered, audiences were divided between awe and confusion. Some called it incomprehensible, others a masterpiece. Its fragmented narrative mirrored Newton's unraveling mind, showing an extraterrestrial destroyed not by violence but by human temptation. The British Board of Film Censors almost blocked its release for scenes depicting moral decay and despair. Behind the scenes, Roeg battled with executives who demanded a linear story. He refused, insisting that Newton's alien perception of time couldn't be told conventionally. The studio cut several sequences, then restored them years later, only to discover the film's surreal pacing was its greatest strength. Bowie's performance was haunting. Critics called it a confession in disguise, as the rock icon's otherworldly detachment blurred with the character's isolation. In later years, Bowie admitted he barely remembered filming due to exhaustion, adding eerie authenticity to Newton's collapse. Though misunderstood at first, The Man Who Fell to Earth became a cultural myth, a warning about alienation, addiction, and capitalism. It inspired generations of directors from Ridley Scott to Denis Villeneuve, who borrowed its lonely imagery of beings lost among men. It asked a question that still echoes today. What if the most human creature on Earth isn't human at all? Number 7. Solaris, 1972. Andrei Tarkovsky's Solaris was the Soviet answer to 2001: A Space Odyssey, but instead of reaching outward, it looked inward, into the heart of guilt and memory. When it premiered, many Western critics dismissed it as slow, even incomprehensible. Yet to those who endured its hypnotic rhythm, it became one of the most profound explorations of consciousness ever filmed. The story centers on psychologist Chris Kelvin sent to a space station orbiting the planet Solaris, where an ocean of sentient plasma manifests human thoughts into physical form. When Kelvin's dead wife mysteriously appears alive, the film stops being science fiction and becomes a metaphysical tragedy. Soviet censors hated it. They accused Tarkovsky of mysticism and pessimism, demanding scenes be cut for undermining the ideology of progress. Tarkovsky fought fiercely and won. He insisted that Solaris wasn't anti-science, it was anti-arrogance. Humanity's flaw, he said, was not that it seeks knowledge, but that it refuses to confront its own soul. The production was grueling. Sets flooded, film reels were lost, and Tarkovsky rewrote scenes daily. Yet, his refusal to compromise produced imagery that felt dreamlike and devastating. Drifting corridors, weightless lovers, the eerie pulse of the alien sea. Over the years, Solaris grew into legend. It won the Grand Prix at Cannes, and later inspired remakes and academic studies. Unlike American sci-fi obsessed with exploration, Solaris asked whether we can truly face what we find inside ourselves. It ended not with triumph, but with surrender, a return to a childhood memory that might not even be real. In Tarkovsky's universe, the scariest frontier was always the human heart. Number 6. The Incredible Shrinking Man, 1957. Although released slightly before the decade began, this visionary film by Jack Arnold defined the spirit that every 60s sci-fi masterpiece would inherit. It was a film of cosmic loneliness wrapped in pulp adventure, a story about man versus the infinite. It begins with an ordinary man named Scott Carey, who after being exposed to a mysterious radioactive cloud starts to shrink. At first, it seems like a bizarre physical ailment, but soon it becomes an existential nightmare. Furniture turns into mountains, spiders become monsters, and his home transforms into a hostile planet. The deeper message is devastating. The smaller he becomes, the larger his awareness grows until he confronts the divine itself. Audiences in the 50s were shocked by its philosophical tone. They expected creature thrills but got a spiritual odyssey about identity and insignificance. When reissued during the 1960s, it found new life among the era's thinkers, who saw it as an allegory for mankind's vanishing morality amid technological power. Censors worried about its closing monologue, where Scott accepts his fate and declares that even the smallest life has meaning. Religious groups objected, claiming it blurred the line between faith and science. But director Arnold refused to change a word. Behind the scenes, the film was a triumph of ingenuity. Sets were built at 10 times scale, and everyday objects became symbols of cosmic terror. A sewing needle, a matchbox, a drop of water. Its ending, where Scott shrinks beyond visibility, yet still exists, remains one of the most poetic moments in cinema history. The Incredible Shrinking Man showed that science fiction could be philosophical, not just spectacular. It whispered a truth more terrifying than any alien invasion. Our universe is vast and indifferent, yet somehow we still matter. Number 5. Quatermass and the Pit, 1967. When Quatermass and the Pit hit theaters in 1967, it wasn't just another monster movie, it was an existential shockwave disguised as one. Adapted from Nigel Neal's BBC serial, this British masterpiece dared to suggest something truly heretical: that humanity's violent instincts were engineered by aliens millions of years ago. The story begins when construction workers digging a London underground station uncover a strange metallic object. At first, the military assumes it's an unexploded bomb from World War II. But as scientists, including the brilliant and skeptical Professor Quatermass, investigate, the truth becomes unthinkable. Inside the object are ancient fossilized remains of insect-like creatures, and psychic disturbances begin to grip the city above. Londoners see visions of chaos, violence, and their own evolutionary origins collapsing into madness. Audiences expecting another B-movie shocker were stunned. This wasn't cheap horror, it was philosophical terror. The film proposed that extraterrestrial visitors once manipulated primitive humans, planting seeds of aggression that would one day destroy civilization. In the middle of the Cold War, that idea felt dangerously close to blasphemy. Religious groups denounced it. British censors debated cutting lines, suggesting that humanity was a failed experiment of alien design. Behind the scenes, the production faced chaos. Hammer Films executives wanted gothic spectacle. Director Roy Ward Baker insisted on quiet dread. The visual effects, simple yet eerie, made the alien craft's psychic eruptions feel disturbingly real. During preview screenings, some viewers fainted during the climactic mass hysteria scene where the ghosts of Martians sweep across London's night sky. Decades later, Quatermass and the Pit is recognized as one of Britain's greatest science fiction achievements, a bridge between pulp and philosophy. Its influence stretches from Alien to The X-Files. Beneath the rubble of London, it unearthed a chilling question that still lingers. What if the monsters we fear most are the ones already inside our... Number 4. Planet of the Vampires. 1965. Before Alien, before Event Horizon, before every haunted spaceship film there was Planet of the Vampires. Directed by Italian visionary Mario Bava, it was dismissed on release as a low-budget oddity. Yet its eerie atmosphere and haunting color palette later became the blueprint for every sci-fi horror masterpiece that followed. The story begins with two spacecraft answering a distress call from a mysterious planet shrouded in fog. As the crews explore the barren world, they discover the bodies of their own dead. And then those corpses rise, possessed by invisible alien life forms feeding on their fear. Audiences in 1965 weren't ready. The film was too dark, too slow, too surreal. American censors demanded scenes be trimmed, claiming the imagery was grotesque and spiritually disturbing. Bava shot the entire film on a soundstage, using colored lighting and mirrors to create vast alien landscapes on a shoestring budget. Behind the scenes, the actors nearly fainted in their heavy rubber suits under sweltering lights. Bava's crew had to move mirrors by hand to simulate cosmic storms. The chaos paid off. His dreamlike visuals, the fog-drenched caverns, the skeletal remains of alien giants, would later inspire Ridley Scott's Alien almost scene for scene. Though ignored in its time, Planet of the Vampires was rediscovered by critics decades later, who hailed it as a masterpiece of visual storytelling. Its legacy lives on in every movie where space itself feels haunted. It proved that the scariest monsters aren't outside. They're the echoes of fear within our own fragile humanity. Number 3. The War Game, 1965. When Peter Watkins released the War Game for the BBC, it was so realistic that the network banned it for nearly 20 years. This wasn't science fiction in the traditional sense. It was a documentary-style nightmare that imagined a nuclear attack on Britain and the horrifying aftermath that followed. Shot like news footage with handheld cameras and non-actors, it portrayed the collapse of society in the days following a nuclear blast. Panic, starvation, riots, and radiation sickness filmed with devastating authenticity. The government immediately intervened. They labeled the film too distressing for public broadcast and locked it away. Only in 1985 did it finally air on television. Audiences who managed to see underground screenings described it as a vision from hell. The British Home Office feared it would ignite anti-nuclear protests, especially during the height of Cold War tension. Watkins himself faced career exile for defying official censorship. Behind the scenes, the BBC had secretly financed the project, believing it to be a simple educational film. When Watkins turned in a visceral masterpiece instead, executives panicked. Yet, critics hailed it as a triumph of realism. It went on to win the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, even though it had never been broadcast in its home country. The War Game's influence cannot be overstated. It shaped later nuclear dramas like Threads and The Day After. It showed that the apocalypse wouldn't come with explosions and monsters. It would come quietly, through bureaucracy, misinformation, and fear. In an age still haunted by nuclear anxiety, The War Game remains a chilling reminder that the most terrifying science fiction is often the closest to truth. Number 2. Seconds, 1966. John Frankenheimer's Seconds was a film that critics didn't understand and audiences weren't ready to face. It told the story of a middle-aged banker who fakes his death and undergoes radical surgery to be reborn as a younger man, played by Rock Hudson. But instead of freedom, he finds emptiness, a life sculpted by corporations who sell identity like a product. When it premiered at Cannes, viewers walked out in silence. American audiences booed. The studio panicked, burying it with almost no promotion. But beneath its failure lay one of the most haunting visions of personal horror ever put to screen. The film's cinematography was revolutionary. Frankenheimer used wide-angle lenses and distorted close-ups to create a sense of disorientation. Every frame felt like a nightmare viewed through broken glass. But the real tragedy came behind the scenes. Rock Hudson, then a symbol of Hollywood perfection, struggled with the role's psychological depth. Critics accused him of miscasting, not realizing he was living the same lie as his character. a man pretending to be someone else. The studio fought to cut key scenes, calling them too bleak for audiences. Frankenheimer refused. He knew seconds wasn't entertainment. It was a scream. The film flopped, but slowly built a cult following among filmmakers like David Fincher and Darren Aronofsky, who cited it as a major influence. Decades later, it stands as one of the great unsung masterpieces of identity and alienation. Seconds dared to ask what would happen if you could start over, and discovered the answer was worse than death. Number 1, 2001, A Space Odyssey, 1968. When Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey premiered, audiences were speechless, literally. Some walked out. Others sat in stunned silence. It was less a movie than a revelation, a cinematic experience that rewired the brain. The story begins with prehistoric man discovering a mysterious black monolith and ends with humanity transcending into something cosmic and unknowable. No narration, no explanations, just sound, color, and silence woven into pure visual philosophy. Critics at first called it pretentious and incomprehensible. MGM feared disaster, but word spread that this wasn't a film to watch, it was a film to feel. Young audiences, especially those immersed in the counterculture, saw it as a spiritual experience. Suddenly, 2001 became the most talked about film of the decade. Behind the scenes, the production was a marathon of perfection. Kubrick demanded total realism. NASA consultants advised on spacecraft design, and hundreds of technicians built rotating sets that simulated zero gravity. Actors were strapped inside giant centrifuges. Douglas Trumbull's groundbreaking visual effects changed filmmaking forever. Censors questioned its ambiguous ending, suggesting Kubrick should clarify the meaning of the Star Child. He refused. He believed the film should evoke emotion, not explanation. The result was a work that bridged science and mysticism, technology, and evolution. Over the decades, its influence has only deepened. Every space film, from Interstellar to Gravity, carries its DNA. Kubrick didn't just film the future, he made the future think about itself. 2001, A Space Odyssey remains the cathedral of science fiction cinema, a meditation on existence that whispers to the stars, asking the question we still can't answer: what lies beyond? The 1960s proved that science fiction was never just about rockets and robots. It was about fear, faith, and the fragile line between progress and madness. Each of these films dared to question what it means to be human. So, which one made you see the future differently? Let us know below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.